Hello, BookTube. I have a tag for you today, at least a variation on one. It's an old style thing that Sean the Bookmaniac came up with years ago called the page 112 tag. He adapted it from a French literary prize in which the prize judges were given a bald manuscript, no author, no publication date, no preambles of any kind, no publicity material, and also nothing of the book except page 112. And they were to judge from that fragment which books would go on to be considered for the prize. The thinking being that the very beginning of a book is heavily worked over by many hands and can often exhibit a polish and a consciousness that falls apart in the rest of the book. And I bet, as inveterate readers, you, like I, have experienced that on many an occasion. So the idea is that page 112 might be where a book starts to show its colors. And Sean changed that into a tag where we all read page 112 of 3 books and discuss. And it's not often done anymore. Rachel Morrow still does page 110 tag, 112 tag regularly, but it's not often done anymore. And one of the things I loved about it wasn't so much the serendipity of, the random chance of page 112 for 3 different books, but rather watching all of you, listening to all of you compare and contrast. Go through a certain piece of prose and weigh it against 2 other pieces of prose that just happen to be juxtapositioned with it. And I want to do that today. I have 3 passages that I want to read you. Yesterday I reread Richard Slotkin's book, The Road to Antietam. Study of his about the Battle of Antietam, about the politics leading up to Antietam, and also about throwing more of a spotlight on a lesser-known aspect of the battle and the politics leading up to it, which is how willing one of the generals, General McClellan, was, or might have been, to be put forward as a military replacement for Abraham Lincoln. Treason. More treason. Added on to the treason of the South, in other words. And that got me thinking, so I have 3 passages about Antietam that I want to read you. And then we'll talk about them. So it's not quite a page 112 tag, especially since works of history, I believe, are a lot less vulnerable to that phenomenon of having their first 100 pages all polished up by many hands. In my experience, they are more heavily worked over, especially if they're by lifelong academics or by popular writers on a subject where the popular writer knows that lifelong academics will be studying every word for weakness. So we're going to read a little bit about the Battle of Antietam. And then we'll see what we see. So here's the first book. Here's the first thing that we're going to do. Now, where are we going to start? At daybreak on the 17th, desultory infantry firing began. As the sun rose, the musketry deepened to a roar, and before the mist lifted from the wood and field, Hooker, that's General Hooker from Boston, was hotly engaged with the veterans of Stonewall Jackson and General Hood. On the Confederate side, the story was one of stubborn resistance, varied by one magnificent charge, that of A.P. Hill's division, which, ordered up from Harper's Ferry at dawn, after marching 17 miles without rest, fell with tigerish ferocity on the Union left. These road-worn troops, flung on advancing corps in confusion back down the ridge toward the Antietam. On the Union side, equal leadership was displayed by one corps commander, Hooker, whose impetuous vigor fairly earned him his sobriquet of Fighting Joe. There's a statue of him on Beacon Hill. But 2 others, Sumner and Burnside, failed to seize the opportunities that might have led to complete victory. Here, McClellan's overall strategy was chiefly at fault, for he had ordered piecemeal attacks instead of the simultaneous assaults along the whole front. At Antietam, the sun looked down on some of the bloodiest close-order fighting of the war. Where Hooker's men fought with Jackson's in a cornfield smitten by artillery on both sides, the losses were murderous. 30 acres of grain, reported Hooker, were cut as close as by a scythe, and on the stubble, Northern and Southern dead lay in heaps. Later, when 2 Union brigades struck Hood's Texan command, the blue and gray seemed like duelists who had lashed themselves together. They stood loading, firing, and reloading at 50 to 80 paces, determined to kill before being killed. In another area, the slain lay by rows, precisely as they had stood in their ranks a few moments before. Francis Palfrey commanded the 20th Massachusetts when Sumner marched a division into an ambush where 10 Confederate brigades took 3 Union brigades in front, flank, and rear. Change of front was impossible, wrote Palfrey later. In less time than it takes to tell it, the ground was strewn with the bodies of the dead and wounded. Nearly 2,000 were disabled in a moment. Imagine that, fire from all sides. The day closed on an undecided field. The Confederates had been forced back on their left by more than a mile, and on their right by half that distance. However, they still held a strong, continuous line passing through Sharpsburg and affording about as many natural advantages as that first chosen. On the field lay a multitude of dead and dying. For the 130,000 men in the two armies, at least 21,000, or 16%, had been slain or wounded. Who can tell, who can even imagine, wrote the colonel of the 20th Massachusetts long after, the horrors of such a night, while the unconscious stars shone down and the unconscious river went rippling by. McClellan stated, or more probably understated, the Union loss as 2,010 killed, 9,416 wounded, and 1,043 missing. The Confederate casualties were fully as great. McClellan reported that after the rebels themselves had buried many, 2,700 were counted and buried by Northern forces. Okay, so that is account number 1. Now we're going to move on to account number 2. We're changing authors here, but we're sticking with the subject of the Battle of Antietam. This war saw many terrible battles, and to try to make a ranking of them is just to compare horrors. But it may be that the Battle of Antietam was the worst of all. It had, at any rate, the fearful distinction of killing and wounding more Americans in one day than any other fight in the war. If there was an essential difference in the fighting qualities of Northern and Southern soldiers, Antietam fails to show it. It was a headlong combat, unrelieved by any tactical brilliance, a slugging match in cornfields and woodlots and on the open slopes of the low hills that came up from the Brown Creek. Neither commanding general did what he wanted to do. Actually, once the fighting got underway, neither commander had a great deal to do with it, except to stand firm and refuse to call retreat. And in the end, it was about as close to a draw as so large a battle could be, except that it became the great turning point of the war, meaning more than either general or either army intended, a grim and fateful landmark in American history. American soldiers never fought harder than they did when they fought each other on September 17th, outside of Sharpsburg. It began in the earliest dawn with a misty drizzle to obscure the half-light, when Federal skirmishers went prowling southward amidst the turnpike and came down to Sharpsburg from Hagerstown. On the left was a big cornfield with stalks taller than a man's head, and on the right there were open pastures rolling off to hills where Jeb Stuart had planted his horse artillery, and straight ahead, about a mile away, the turnpike went over a bit of rising ground and past a whitewashed Dunker church, picturesquely framed by an open grove of trees. If the Federals could occupy this ground around the church, they would break the left end of Lee's battle line, and McClellan had called for a big attack, one Army Corps to make the first drive, and 2 more to come in beside and behind it to make the crusher. Okay, so that is the second account, with a little bit more of a wide-angle lens. And now we'll do the third account, still sticking with Antietam, but we're going to a third author here. Let's see here. Where do we want to go here? There were a great many of both. What do we want here? I want to set this up. As a result, the armies lay face to face all day like sated lions. And between them, on the slopes of the Sharpsburg Ridge and in the valley of the Antietam, the dead began to fester in the heat, and the cries of the wounded faded to mewling. There were a great many of both, that is, dead and wounded. The effluvium of this bloodiest day of the war. Nearly 11,000 Confederates and more than 12,000 Federals had fallen along that ridge and in that valley, including a total on both sides of about 5,000 dead. Losses at South Mountain raised these doleful numbers to 13,609 and 14,756 respectively, the latter being increased 27,276 by the surrender of the Harper's Ferry garrison. Lee had suffered only half as many casualties as he had inflicted in the course of the campaign, but even this was more than he could afford. "Where is your division?" someone asked Hood at the close of the battle, and Hood replied, "Dead on the field." After entering the fight with 854 men, the Texas Brigade came out with less than 300, and these figures were approximated in other veteran units, particularly in Jackson's command. The troops Lee lost were the best he had, the best he could ever hope to have in the long war that lay ahead, now that his try for an early ending by invasion had been turned back. Orders for the retirement were issued that afternoon, and at nightfall, in accordance with those orders, fires were kindled along the ridge to curtain the retreat across the Potomac. Longstreet went first, forming in support of Pendleton's guns on the opposite bank. 2 brigades of cavalry followed, then moved upstream, prepared to recross and harry the enemy flank in case the withdrawal was contested. Walker's division was the last to cross. At sunup, as Walker followed the trail of his column into the waist-deep water of the ford, he saw Lee sitting his gray horse in midstream. Apparently he had been there all night. When Walker reported all of his troops safely across the river except some wagon loads of wounded and a battery of artillery, which were close at hand, Lee showed for the first time the strain he had been under. "Thank God," he said. And there you go. There's 3 little windows into how 3 different authors looked at the Battle of Antietam. Some aspects of it, not all exactly the same, and of course not page 112 of each. The first one is Alan Nevins, who we just saw on this channel. I just recently got his 8-volume history of the war. You'll notice one of the differences between these 3 is that the numbers vary. All 3 of these passages are very much about numbers, about those staggering casualties on the one day of battle. But the numbers aren't the same. They vary just a bit. And one of the things you might remember about Nevins is that he concentrates on those numbers. They mean a lot more to him. His passage might be said to be the driest of the 3. But still, I thought, very good, very commanding. And the next one is Bruce Catton, the Terrible Swift Sword. And it was more colorful, a little more dramatic. And also, as I mentioned, it had a tendency towards stepping back. Bruce Catton does that all throughout his own history of the Civil War. He will give you the raw details, the numbers, dead and wounded, the specific divisions and brigades and the commanders and the comments and whatnot. But he periodically takes a step back to say of all the battles in the war, of all the concerns in the war, all that sort of thing. And I think it adds a magisterial quality to his books that for instance, Nevins tends not to do. Nevins was much more of a lifelong newspaper reporter than Bruce Catton. He tends not to take that big view. I think probably because he suspects it of being too easy or being the product of hindsight. And maybe it might be, but Catton is so eloquent about it that I don't mind. I don't mind at all. And then speaking of eloquence, in this particular passage, I think we can probably agree that passage number 3 was the best written. And that is from Shelby Foote. That is from Shelby Foote's 3-volume history of the American Civil War, which is more eloquent at a slight sacrifice of the kind of nitty-gritty reporter's details that are in both of the other 2. And all 3 of these concentrate on the significance of Antietam. That this was an attempt on Robert E. Lee's part to break the concentration, break the commitment of the North by invading and actually threatening the capital, actually threatening Washington, and hoping that along the way he could recruit enough men and recoup enough equipment, both of which he was in dire need of, to make it self-sustaining, to make it worth the effort. That turned out not to be true. And all 3 of these authors concentrate on that. They also concentrate on another salient aspect of the Battle of Antietam, which was that everyone in the North, especially in positions of power in Washington, from Lincoln to his assistants in either political party to friends and enemies of George McClellan himself, were all incensed that McClellan did not pursue Lee's army, that he did not crush it. He had the ability to do that. Had he struck at that, you mentioned that that Lee put out pickets in case his retreat was contested. Well, there was a good reason for that. Lee was right to suspect that, because any kind of enterprising commander would have contested that retreat, absolutely would have done so. Lee's army, not so much at Antietam as later, could have been effectively annihilated. And it took no effort on the part of even armchair generals back in Washington to see that. And yet McClellan didn't do it. Which kind of underscores the political machinations of Slotkin's book even more effectively. And of course, there's one other consideration of Antietam, which is that Lincoln was looking for anything, any kind of victory on the battlefield, for him to do a maneuver of his own, for him to make the Emancipation Proclamation, which all three of these writers characterize as a maneuver of war. They all do it in various different ways. I almost read from that, their characterization of that, instead of their characterization of the battle. Maybe next time, as I do so love reading passages that echo each other like this. For myself, I'm not sure that a lifetime of habit in reading is really going to dislodge Bruce Catton from being my favorite among these three writers. But I'd be curious to know which one you liked, to the limited extent that you could determine that from my inept reading. So feel free to let me know. I just thought this. I've been looking at these books since I got the Nevins and have been rereading chunks of him. That has been sending me elsewhere, not only to my individual studies like Slotkin, but also to Bruce Catton and Shelby Foote. So as I was doing that, I thought I would drag you along for the ride. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now. Just a little bit of a reading tag, but I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.